Hi, and welcome to your next PB&J video tutorial class. Today I'll be sharing two techniques using the following brushstroke stamps from Penny Black: Daisy Fields and Lofty. And here's a look at the two cards that we'll be creating. They both are shaped cards using Spellbinder's Labels 8. The first technique I'll be sharing is using brushstroke stamps with distress stains. And this is the card that uses that technique. We'll begin by taking Penny Black Daisy Fields and inking it by dabbing the stains directly onto the areas of the stamp we want to ink. So I'm starting there with Broken China, and now I'm adding Wild Honey and Fired Brick. And then I'll take Vintage Photo and just dab that in the center of the flowers, and Peeled Paint I will swipe across the stems. And these do not need to be perfect. We want this to have a watercolor look. Then I'll stamp directly down onto my heavyweight cardstock. And you'll see you can quickly color those stamps and you get that watercolor look that works so well with the brushstroke stamps. Now I'm going to ink this again, so I cleaned off the stamp and I'm starting again, adding Wild Honey and now Fired Brick, Broken China, and then Vintage Photo towards the center, and of course Peeled Paint onto the stems. And then I'll just re-stamp this over on the side. And I'm not worried about the very bottom of this piece because we'll be covering it up. So finally I cleaned off my stamp again. I'm re-inking with Broken China, Fired Brick, Wild Honey, and then Vintage Photo, Peeled Paint for the stems, stamping straight down, cleaning off the stamp. Then I wanted to fill in that gap that I had there. So I'm just taking Broken China and Vintage Photo on this one flower and just stamping it right into that space there. So you can see how fun and easy it is to work with the brushstroke stamps and the stains. Now to finish off the card, I have another piece cut from that same Spellbinder's Labels 8 die, which I'm inking with Peeled Paint Distress Ink, and this is the foam applicator pad and the ink blending tool. Starting off of the edge and working my way on in a circular motion. And I want this to be pretty dark, so I'm putting on a few layers. I'm also going to add walnut stain just around the edges, so I'm holding it in my hand and dabbing the foam pad around the edges. I'll apply adhesive to the back and then adhere this right onto the front of the card. Now I want to add just a little bit of distressing up top here, so I'm using old paper, and that's the color I like to use if I don't want it to look too distressed, but I don't want it to be stark white. A little bit of that old paper distress ink around the edges just kind of finishes it off. Now I'm going to add my sentiment, but first I'm going to ink this paper with old paper just around the edges. And then I'm taking this Penny Black stamp called Thinking of You, which I'll be inking with black VersaFine ink. And stamping onto our strip of cardstock. And then I'm just deciding here where I want to trim that in the shape of the banner. So I'm just marking with my pen where to trim. Now I'll cut from the corner to the dot and the dot down to the other corner. I'll apply adhesive to the back of this piece. And then turn to the back to trim the excess from the right-hand side. I'll add a little bit of old paper around that edge where I trimmed. And then to finish off this card, I've just added some twine, a pearl, and then mounted it onto another Spellbinders die cut the same size. The next technique I'm sharing is working with brushstroke stamps using colored pencils. And here's the card that uses this technique. So to begin, I'm taking this penny black stamp called Lofty, and I'm going to ink this with a very light ink. So the ink that I like to use is antique linen, but any very light ink will work. And I'm going to stamp it 3 times onto this die cut piece. Again, this is another Spellbinders Labels 8, but it's just a little bit smaller than the piece we were working on the last card. And you can see that it's real light, but it's just stamped right onto the cardstock. And then I'm using the Faber-Castell Art Grip colored pencils. I'm just zooming in here so you can see. And I've sped this up so that it goes pretty quickly. But basically what I'm doing is just coloring right on top of that light ink, the antique linen that we stamped. I'm starting with my lightest colored pencil and just very lightly coloring over the top. Now I'll take a little bit darker, this is sort of a golden brown, and add some shading right on top of that light color. And then to blend that out, I'm going back with that original color, but this time I'm pressing much harder as I color over the golden brown and into the lighter color that was already there. And this sort of blends that out. And you can see by stamping in that light ink and coloring over the top, you get a really nice, almost hand-drawn and colored look rather than stamped, just by using this technique. So now here on this next flower, I'm using a light red, and I'm coloring very lightly. I'm not pressing very hard. Now I'll take a darker red and add my shading. Go back with a lighter red, coloring over the top, and this time pressing harder than I did the very first time. That will blend it out. And we're ready to add this technique on the last flower. So I'm starting with a light blue. Then I'll go in with a little bit darker blue. And then go back and shade and blend that out using the lightest blue that I started with. Now I'm just going in here and going over some of the fine details. And I will say it does help to have very sharp pencils, so I keep my sharpener right with me as I do this technique. And then I'm also using that brown just to darken up some of that shading on these. So I'm just going right over the top with that golden brown color. And then here we're coloring in the grass with the stems. Again, using a very sharp pencil. I'll go in with a darker green just to add a little bit of shading. And one thing that's nice with this type of stamp, with the brushstroke stamps, is if you go off the line that you've previously stamped, just go with it. Make that a little bit thicker stem like I did right there, and nobody will know. And then the last thing, I'm just using a regular pencil just to add in a little bit of an outline to finish it off. A black or a gray colored pencil would also work. I just couldn't find mine, so I used just a regular pencil. Now we're ready to add some distress ink, so I'm using peeled paint right along the bottom. And then for the sky, we'll use broken china. And I am being careful not to apply a lot of ink right over the top of the flowers. I don't want to lose any of that color, so I'm sort of working my way around them. Now I'm taking penny black letter background, which I'll be inking with old paper distress ink. I'm dabbing off some of that ink with a baby wipe before stamping. And you can see it's just a nice subtle background. Now here's the larger Spellbinders Labels 8. And I'm going to ink this using the distress stains and applying them directly to the paper. So this is a fired brick. And I'm just going to swipe this across the paper, going in the same direction, up and down across the paper. And I'm not squeezing the bottle very much. I don't want a lot of ink to come out because I want to keep some of that variation in the background. I also was careful not to get my paper too wet so that it curls. Now I'm taking that same color of fired brick distressing and applying it over the top. And so what's nice is that you keep that texture in the background, but it's not too busy that it takes away from the main image. And I'm not worried about the center because it's going to be covered up. I'll use walnut stain just to dab around the edges. And then we'll mount our final piece on here using pop dots. And here's a look at the finished card. I just added a couple of butterflies and pearl for the center. And here's another look at the two of those together, featuring two techniques with brushstroke stamps. Thanks so much for watching. For details and more information, visit www.pennyblackink.com.